After the failure in Canada, 20 years passed away before the French again attempted to colonize. Then, 1562, Admiral Coligny, the leader of the Huguenots, or Protestants of France, sought to plant a colony in America for his persecuted countrymen, and sent forth an expedition under Ribaut. These Frenchmen reached the coast of Florida, and turning northward came to a haven which they called Port Royal. Here they built a fort in what is now South Carolina. Leaving 30 men to hold it, Ribaut sailed for France. Famine, homesickness, ignorance of life in a wilderness soon brought the colony to ruin. Unable to endure their hardships longer, the colonists built a crazy boat, put to sea, and when off the French coast were rescued by an English vessel. 2 years later, 1564, Coligny tried again, and sent forth a colony under Laudonnière. It reached the coast of Florida, and a few miles up the St. Johns River built a fort called Caroline in honor of the French King Charles. The next year there came more colonists under Ribaut. Now it so happened that just at this time a Spaniard named Menendez had obtained leave to conquer and settle Florida. Before he could set off, news came to Spain that the French were on the St. Johns River, and Menendez was sent with troops to drive them out. He landed in Florida in 1565 and built a fort which was the beginning of St. Augustine, the first permanent settlement on the mainland part of the United States. Ribaut at once sailed to attack it. But while he was at sea, Menendez marched overland, took Fort Caroline, and put to death every man there, save a few who made good their escape. More than 70 years had now passed since Columbus made his great voyage of discovery. Yet, save some Portuguese settlements in Brazil, the only European colonies in America were Spanish. From St. Augustine, around the Gulf of Mexico, down South America to the Strait of Magellan and up the west coast to California, save the foothold of Portugal, island, and mainland belonged to Spain. And all the rest of North America she claimed. So far in the 16th century, England had taken little or no part in the work of discovery, exploration, and settlement. Her fishermen came to the Banks of Newfoundland, but not till 1562, in the reign of Queen Elizabeth, did the contact of England with the New World really begin. Then it was that Sir John Hawkins, one of England's great sea kings, went to Africa, loaded his ships with Africans, sold them to planters in Haiti, and came home with hides and pearls. Such trade for one not a Spaniard was against the law of Spain. But Hawkins cared not, ere it came again and again. When foul weather drove him into a Mexican port, the Spaniards sank most of his ships, but Hawkins escaped with 2 vessels, in one of which was Francis Drake. Smarting under defeat, Drake resolved to be avenged. Fitting out a little squadron at his own cost, without leave of the Queen, Drake, 1572, sailed to the Caribbean Sea, plundered Spanish towns along the coast, captured Spanish ships, and went home loaded with gold, silver, and merchandise. During this raid on the Spanish coast, Drake marched across the Isthmus of Panama and looked down upon Balboa's great South Sea. As he looked, he resolved to sail on it, and in 1577 left England with 5 ships on what proved to be the greatest voyage since that of Magellan. He crossed the Atlantic, sailed down the coast of South America, and entered the Strait of Magellan. Their 4 ships deserted, but Drake went on alone up the west coast, plundering towns and capturing Spanish vessels. To return the way he came would have been dangerous, for Spanish cruisers lay in wait. Drake, therefore, went on up the coast in search of a passage through the continent to the Atlantic. Coasting as far as southern Oregon and finding no passage, Drake turned southward, entered a harbor, repaired his ship, and then started westward across the Pacific. He touched at the Philippines, visited the Spice Islands, came home by way of the Cape of Good Hope, and won the glory of being the first Englishman to sail around the globe. While Drake was on his voyage around the world, Martin Frobisher discovered Hudson Strait, and Sir Humphrey Gilbert failed in an attempt to plant a colony somewhere in America. The failure was disheartening. But the return of Drake laden with spoil aroused new interest in America, and, in 1583, Gilbert led a colony to Newfoundland. Disaster after disaster overtook him, and while he was on his way home with 2 vessels, all that were left of 5, one with Gilbert on board, went down at sea. The work of colonization then passed to Sir Walter Raleigh, a half-brother of Gilbert. He began by sending out a party of explorers who sailed along the coast of North Carolina and brought back such a glowing description of the country that the Queen named it Virginia, and Raleigh chose it for the site of a colony. In 1585, accordingly, a party of men commanded by Ralph Lane were landed on Roanoke Island. But the site proved to be ill chosen, and the Indians were hostile. The colonists were poorly fitted to live in a wilderness, and were almost starving when Drake, who stopped at Roanoke, 1586, to see how they were getting on, carried them back to England. Not long after Drake sailed away with the colonists, a party of recruits arrived with supplies. Finding the island deserted, 15 men remained to hold the place in the Queen's name, and the rest returned to England. Not disheartened by these reverses, Raleigh summoned some men of influence to his aid, and, in 1587, sent out a third party of settlers, both men and women, in charge of John White. This party was to stop at Roanoke Island, pick up the 15 men there, and then go on to Chesapeake Bay. But for some reason the settlers were left on the island by the convoy, and there they were forced to stay. White very soon went back to England for help, and the only ship the colonists had. War with Spain prevented his return for several years, and then only the ruins of the settlement were found on the island. The war which prevented White from promptly returning to Roanoke began in 1585. The next year, with 25 ships, Drake attacked the possessions of Spain in America, and burned and plundered several towns. In 1587 he singed the beard of the King of Spain by burning 100 vessels in the harbor of the Spanish city of Cadiz. Enraged by these defeats, King Philip II of Spain determined to invade England and destroy that nest of sea rovers. A great fleet known as the Invincible Armada, carrying 30,000 men, was assembled and in 1588 swept into the English Channel. There the English, led by Raleigh, Drake, Frobisher, Hawkins, Lane, and all the other great sea kings, met the Armada, drove it into the North Sea, and captured, burned, and sank many of the ships. The rest fled around Scotland, on whose coast more were wrecked. Less than half the Armada returned to Spain. The war lasted 16 years longer, till 1604. Though it delayed, it did not stop attempts at colonization. In 1602 Bartholomew Gosnold, with a colony of 32 men, sailed from England, saw the coast of Maine, turned southward, named Cape Cod and the Elizabeth Islands, and after a short stay went home. The next year Martin Pring came with 2 vessels on an exploring and trading voyage, and in 1605 George Weymouth was sent out, visited the Kennebec River in Maine, and brought back a good report of the country. The Virginia Charter of 1606, peace had now been made with Spain. England had not been forced to stop her attempts to colonize in America. The favorable reports of Gosnold, Pring, and Weymouth led to the belief that colonies could be successfully planted, and in 1606 King James I chartered 2 commercial companies to colonize Virginia, as the Atlantic seaboard region was called. To the first, or London Company, was granted the right to plant a colony anywhere along the coast between 34 degrees and 41 degrees of north latitude, between Cape Fear River and the Hudson. To the second, or Plymouth Company, was given the right to plant a colony anywhere between 38 degrees and 45 degrees, between the Potomac River and the Bay of Fundy. Each company was to have a tract of land 100 miles square, 50 miles along the coast each way from the first settlement and 100 miles inland, and to prevent overlapping, it was provided that the company last to settle should not locate within 100 miles of the other company's settlement. The charter having been granted, each company set about securing immigrants. To get them was not difficult, for in England at that day there were many people whose condition was so desperate that they were glad to seek a new home beyond the sea. In a few months, therefore, the Plymouth Company sent out its first party of colonists, but the ship was seized by the Spaniards. The next year, 1607, the company sent out 100 or more settlers in 2 ships. They landed in August at the mouth of the Kennebec River and built a fort, a church, a storehouse, and 15 log cabins. These men were wholly unfit for life in a wilderness, and in December about half went home in the ships in which they came. The others passed a dismal winter, and when a relief ship arrived in the spring, all went back, and the Plymouth Company's attempt to colonize ended in failure. Meanwhile, another band of Englishmen had been sent out by the London Company to found a colony in what is now Virginia. They set sail in December, 1606, in 3 ships under Captain Newport, and in April, 1607, reached the entrance of Chesapeake Bay. Sailing westward across the bay, the ships entered a river which was named the James in honor of the king, and on the bank of this river the party landed and founded Jamestown. With this event began the permanent occupation of American soil by Englishmen. At this time, more than 100 years after the voyages of Columbus, the only other European settlers on the Atlantic coast of the United States were the Spaniards in Florida.